Helen Parker had always considered herself strong. A widow for nearly 5 years, she had built a quiet, isolated life for herself. She'd lost her husband, Mark, in a car accident that had shaken her to the core. Since that tragic day, she had done what she could to survive. The house felt empty without him, but she filled it with routine and the memories they shared, hoping the echoes of his laughter would be enough to keep her sane. But every now and then, the loneliness would creep in. And tonight was one of those nights. Helen sat alone at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. The house was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind howling outside. It had been a long day. She'd finished her chores, watered the plants, and even spent a little time looking through the photo albums, as she often did when she felt particularly nostalgic. She missed Mark more than she could bear, but the pain had softened over the years, replaced by a dull ache that was more familiar than sorrow. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was unusual for anyone to stop by this late, and her heart skipped a beat as she wondered who it could be. She stood up, her mind racing with possibilities, before making her way to the front door. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Standing there, looking as though he hadn't aged a day, was Jake Thompson. Jake, the best friend of her son, Evan, who had moved away after high school and had lost touch with the family. He was now in his late 20s, and he'd grown into a man who looked so much like the young boy Helen had known, but with a more mature, confident air about him. His hair was a little shorter, and his eyes were still as kind and warm as she remembered. But it was the faint hint of something more in his gaze that caught her off guard. Something unfamiliar, something that made her heart race. "Jake," Helen stammered, a smile spreading across her face as she stepped aside to let him in. "It's been so long." Jake smiled back, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "Yeah, it's been a while. I've been meaning to come by and visit. I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all," Helen said, brushing a strand of hair from her face, trying to ignore the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "It's good to see you. How's Evan?" Jake's expression softened as he stepped inside. "He's doing well. He couldn't make it, but he said to say hello. He's busy with work and life. You know how it is." Helen nodded, though she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. Evan had always been close with Jake, but they drifted apart as they grew older. It had been years since she had seen Jake. She was surprised by how much she had missed him. "Come on in. I'll make us some tea," Helen said, her voice steady as she led him into the living room. As they sat down, the awkwardness between them slowly started to melt away. They talked about the past, reminiscing about Evan's childhood, and laughed at some of the old memories. Helen felt at ease, grateful for the company. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed the sound of someone else's voice in the house. They sat there, sipping tea and catching up on old times. But as the conversation continued, Helen couldn't help but notice the way Jake's gaze lingered on her a little longer than it should have. There was something about the way he looked at her now, something different from the young boy she remembered. The evening wore on, and the comfortable silence between them grew. There was a certain tension in the air, though neither of them spoke of it. Helen's mind wandered back to Mark, and she couldn't help but compare the way she had once looked at him to the way she was now looking at Jake. She quickly pushed the thought aside. It wasn't right. Jake was practically family. But as the night went on, Helen couldn't deny the strange pull she felt toward him. There was an undeniable chemistry between them, something that made her heart race every time he spoke. It was subtle, but it was there. And she couldn't shake the feeling that Jake wasn't just here to catch up with an old friend's family. After a while, Jake stood up, stretching his arms above his head. "I should probably get going soon. I didn't mean to keep you up so late." Helen stood too, a little disappointed at the thought of him leaving. "It was nice to see you again, Jake. You should come by more often." Jake smiled, his eyes softening. "I will. I promise." As he reached for his coat, their eyes met again, and for a moment there was a pause, a silence that hung between them, thick and heavy with unspoken words. Helen felt her heart skip a beat, but she quickly forced herself to look away. "Well, good night," Jake said, his voice low, almost uncertain. "Good night, Jake," Helen replied, her voice just as soft. But as Jake walked out the door, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. She couldn't explain it, but she knew deep down that this visit had stirred something inside of her. A part of her that she had buried for years, a part that she had thought was long gone. As the door clicked shut behind Jake, Helen stood there for a moment, lost in thought. She had never considered Jake in that way, but now something felt different. The weight of his presence lingered in the room, and she felt a sudden rush of warmth flood her cheeks. What was happening to her? She shook her head, trying to clear the confusion. It was just a visit, nothing more. But as she went to bed that night, her thoughts continued to wander back to Jake and the feelings he had awakened in her. And as she drifted off to sleep, Helen couldn't help but wonder what the future held. She had spent so many years living in the past, clinging to the memories of Mark. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to think about the future again. Helen lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts consumed by the visit from Jake. It was as if a new chapter of her life had begun, one she hadn't expected, nor was she sure she was ready for. The warmth in her cheeks hadn't faded since Jake left, and her mind kept wandering back to the look in his eyes. She hadn't felt this alive in years, but also, she hadn't felt this conflicted. Her life had been a quiet routine for so long. There had been no room for anything more. After Mark's death, everything had come to a standstill. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now echoed with silence. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, Helen had felt something stir within her. It wasn't just the nostalgia of the past, but something new, something unfamiliar. The thought of Jake lingered in her mind as she drifted off to sleep. But her dreams were restless, filled with fragments of memories, of Mark, of Jake, and of a future she hadn't yet imagined. The next morning, Helen awoke with a heaviness in her chest. The lingering emotions from the previous night hadn't faded, and she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward Jake. It wasn't just about what he represented, his youth, his strength, or the comfort of the familiar. But there was something more. She knew she needed to face what she was feeling, but she didn't know how to begin. As she prepared breakfast, she found herself glancing at the clock every few minutes, wondering if Jake might stop by again. She knew it was silly to expect him to visit so soon, but the thought of seeing him again, of hearing his voice, stirred something deep inside her. Around noon, the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened the door, she was surprised to find Jake standing there again, this time with a slight smile on his face. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, his voice warm and comforting. "No, not at all," Helen replied, stepping aside to let him in. "I'm glad you came by." Jake's smile widened as he stepped into the living room. "I was hoping we could talk," he said, his tone more serious now. Helen nodded, her heart beating faster. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Jake hesitated for a moment before sitting down. "Helen, I've been thinking a lot about last night. About us. I know this might sound strange, but I think there's something between us. Something I can't ignore." Helen's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to say that. She had known, deep down, that there was a connection between them, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. She sat down across from him, her heart racing. "Jake," she began, her voice soft. "I don't know what to say. I've spent so many years living in the past, holding on to memories of Mark. I've never even thought about the future, or about anyone else." Jake reached out, his hand gently brushing hers. "I know. I get it. And I'm not asking you to forget Mark. What I'm asking is if you can open your heart to something new, to a future that doesn't just belong to the past." Helen looked down at their hands, a thousand thoughts racing through her mind. Could she really move forward? Was it possible to let go of the past without dishonoring it? She had spent so long grieving, so long living in the shadow of her memories, that the idea of a future seemed impossible. But as she looked up at Jake, she saw the sincerity in his eyes, the warmth in his smile. He wasn't asking her to forget, only to consider the possibility of something more. And that scared her. It scared her because she didn't know how to let go of the grief, the guilt, the years of mourning. I don't know if I can," Helen whispered, her voice trembling. "I've built my life around this grief. I don't even know what it would look like to move forward. Jake squeezed her hand gently. You don't have to have all the answers right now, Helen. Just think about it, one step at a time. For the next few hours, they talked about life, about their pasts, about their hopes for the future. Jake shared his experiences of the years he'd spent away, how he'd built his life, and how he had never really stopped thinking about the family he had left behind. Helen listened, captivated by the honesty in his voice, the way he spoke of his journey. And in a way, it helped her see that she, too, could move forward one small step at a time. As the afternoon turned into evening, Jake stood up to leave. I'll let you think about it, he said, his voice soft and understanding. I don't want to rush you, but I'm here, Helen, whenever you're ready. Helen stood as well, feeling a mix of emotions. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. A possibility. Thank you, Jake, she said, her voice steady. I'll think about it. Jake gave her a small, reassuring smile before walking toward the door. Take care, Helen. As the door closed behind him, Helen stood there for a moment, her heart pounding. She had a lot to process, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. She didn't feel trapped in the past. There was a future ahead of her, a future she could shape with her own hands. The next few days were filled with introspection. Helen thought about Jake, about the conversation they had, and about the life she had built for herself since Mark's passing. She couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him, but there was still a part of her that was unsure. Was she ready to take that step? Could she truly open her heart again after all this time? The answer came to her one quiet evening as she sat by the window, watching the sun set. She had spent so many years hiding from the future, holding on to memories that could never be relived. But now she realized it was time to live again. Not just for herself, but for the future she had yet to embrace. The next day, she called Jake. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady and sure. I don't know where this will go, but I'm ready to take that first step. Jake's response was immediate, his voice filled with relief and joy. I'm so glad to hear that, Helen. We'll take it slow, one step at a time. And so their journey together began, not with grand declarations or promises, but with small, meaningful steps toward a future neither of them could have anticipated. But for the first time in years, Helen felt alive again, not stuck in the past, but embracing the possibilities of what lay ahead.